When, Rebecca, when was the first time you ever came across or heard of Wuthering Heights?
Oh my goodness, I don't know if I can remember that. It would have been a long, long time ago. I think I might have had a children's version of it, an abridged version. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure, but it would have been
I
a long
didn't
time
know they
ago.
existed. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
there
think.
was a children's version.
Yeah, I think I had a series of sort of like abridged classics for when I was learning to read, and then I quite early on, I think it was one of those books that I read as kind of a child or a teenager, maybe a bit young, to kind
Mhm.
of to fully get it. I reread Jane Eyre recently and had a completely different experience with it than I had done the first time round. I'm sure that lots of people can relate to that. But what about you, Hannah? When did you first come across it? Do you remember the moment?
I think it was A level, but not because I was studying Wuthering Heights. I was studying Philip Larkin,
Mm,
and Philip Larkin and Emily Bronte aren't writers I would have put together about
mm.
anything. But his poetry and him, and also the way the English teacher was about him, he was so drab's the wrong word, because his poetry is interesting, but it just sounds like his life was quite dull. That's the
Yeah.
best way I can describe it. He didn't seem to believe in love. He didn't seem to believe in marriage. He wasn't a very passionate man. And it doesn't sound like his mum and dad were too passionate either. So
Mm.
it was just a little anecdote. It was Philip Larkin's mum and dad, how they met. I think she was reading Wuthering Heights on a park bench, and he just said, "What are you reading?" And she said, "Wuthering Heights." And that was my first introduction to Wuthering Heights. I thought, "What's that
Oh,
about?" Yeah.
it's
Um,
kind of a shame that their romance didn't work out because that's quite a meet cute. That's sweet.
yeah. Well,
But
yeah. I
I
mean,
guess it did work out. But if they weren't, it's a shame that they weren't happy together. But knowing the novel, maybe it was an omen.
yeah. I'm only guessing that they weren't happy together because Philip himself, like their only child, didn't. Not that he didn't believe in marriage because he wanted to be bohemian and just sleep around. It wasn't that. He just didn't. He didn't believe in love and trust and being with another person. So his mum and dad must have influenced that, surely.
Yeah, interesting. Hmm.
Yeah, and obviously it's a very passionate novel. So and she was
Yeah,
reading it, but the passion didn't kind of come out of the book there.
yeah. It is. It's interesting that because it's a novel where passion and marriage aren't always synonymous. So in a way, it's a novel we associate with deep kind of passionate romance, but there's some really dysfunctional marriages. There's at least one that I can think of, isn't there? That sort of Catherine marries the not she doesn't marry her soulmate kind of on
No,
purpose. Spoilers. Sorry for anyone who hasn't.
yeah,
If you haven't read it and you this is going to be a spoilery type problem, don't watch this. I think we're going to
no,
deep dive.
yeah. This is all about Wuthering Heights, and there will be spoilers as we dive into all of the characters and Heathcliff in particular. But Kathy, she is asked, I think, is it Nellie who kind of says, "Oh, why don't you marry Heathcliff? He's a lovely lad." Bit wild, but and she basically says, doesn't she? No, that wouldn't be appropriate. Someone like me with someone like Heathcliff,
Mm,
um, and that is just the catalyst, isn't it? That is
yeah.
that is that is the start of Heathcliff. Mark Two, where
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Yes, he storms out. He overhears part of the conversation and not all of the conversation, I think, from memory. And that kind of that the rupture kind of ripples through the rest of the story from that moment, I think. Yeah.
yeah, overhearing just parts of the conversation, how many issues has that caused? Not just in our book, just in life. Oh, I heard her saying this. It's like, well, you didn't hear the full thing. And we take things out
Yes.
of context all the time on
Yeah.
social media, you
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. Yeah, and actually that's hard because it's interesting on Substack. a big section of my audience, probably yours as well, is American, which was something I wasn't expecting necessarily. And there's a slightly different tone sometimes to the way that British people type. The way that we communicate, maybe a bit more sardonic or sarcastic, and every now and again you fall foul of that and you want to go, no, don't worry,
Yeah,
that wasn't
I was
being me.
just
I
being
was being
sarcastic.
self-deprecating.
Yeah, I was just being me. Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to put you at ease, and I've actually accidentally made you think that I'm speaking down to you. But yes.
Yeah. Or just, giving yourself a really hard time about things. It's like, no, that is just how we are. That's our sense of humor. That's something that we would laugh at. But yeah, like, Wuthering Heights, for me, I don't really regard it a romance as much as other people might.
Yeah, agreed.
And I'm happy for other people to think, oh yeah, it's romantic. But picking it up, I think it was in second year uni. We were doing Victorian lit, and I'm reading it as like a 19-year-old. I just thought, all these people are awful. This is awful. This is, Catherine's awful. But I've got girls next to me going, oh, so romantic.
Yeah.
Which camp did you fall into?
Definitely the same as you. I don't think I ever sort of romanticized Heathcliff. He's not, they're fascinating, and they're kind of, they're not quite as bad as this, but there's a slightly kind of like I don't know, Rose and Fred West, or like those couples that kill, like Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, these like awful couples that are just sort of so caught up in each other, and are toxic to everyone around them, I suppose would be the word. But they're sort of fascinating, and you kind of want them to be together because it feels like they should. It feels like there's a sort of they should be. There's a kind of law of the universe that's broken if they're not. But also they're just awful people. They're horrible to everybody else around them. No, I find Heathcliff's quite. I suppose, especially now, I feel a bit more sympathetic to Heathcliff because of his kind of cultural and class background, which stands out to me a little bit more as an adult, reading it with more knowledge about the time period. He's somebody who's sort of like brought to the house as an outsider. Doesn't really have, who knows who his family really are. In some, I think he's supposed to be not Caucasian. There are some suggestion that he's of Romani or a background, so traveling people, or he's somebody who potentially, for kind of like racial reasons as well, it comes from a discriminated a class which is discriminated against, and socially, definitely. That's very clear. He's not got the wealth and the comfort that that Kathy marries into. So I feel like there's a kind of a bitterness and a cruelty and a harshness to Heathcliff that I think I maybe am more sympathetic to as an adult, thinking about him growing up as a person in that world. I don't know whether we think much about his the way that his name defines him. Him being kind of named for the sort of like the harsh northern weather, as if he's almost like a changeling child being brought in from the storm. He's almost a kind of manifestation of all these like harshnesses about the world, and they've molded him into the man that he is when he's bitter and we meet him for the first time at the beginning. Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of my take on Heathcliff. I've never really fancied him.
No, well, they work on that when they cast for the films, don't they? But yeah, he's kind of dragged up. He's a product of his environment. But yeah, as someone has said in the comments about the brutality of the landscape, the harsh northern moors. And about Heathcliff's kind of origin story as well. Now, he was found on the streets of Liverpool, and I can confirm that could mean he's from absolutely anywhere, because there were, people in Liverpool were more familiar with ports around the world than they were with the Cotswolds or even Birmingham. So he could have been from around anywhere. But I did see recently an interesting article about how it could actually be as simple as Heathcliff being Irish.
Yeah.
Because at the time, the Irish, who, as with anyone, didn't like being oppressed by a foreign power, were seen as wild, untamed. They spoke and gibberish. Heathcliff is described as speaking gibberish. This wild, dark hair, and I need to find the article, but the article basically cited some illustrations in newspapers at the time, and it was portraying the Irish as kind of dirty, dark-haired. They don't respect the values. They don't have the same values that we have, and so on. So in like the 1840s, when a lot of Irish people had to come to the UK, notably Liverpool, they were very much treated by the rest of England as, the foreigners. And I even have Father Nugent, when he started his career as a priest, he would work with the Catholic families and try and kind of integrate the kids, into the school, because the parents had come over and didn't speak a word of English, or at least they said they didn't speak English, but they didn't want to merge with the English. Kind of being with the Catholic Church was their little bridge to being able to cope living in England. But they were very much vilified and seen as the other and the strangers. So yeah, whether he's gypsy, whether he's like North African, Indian, whatever, he is other. He is not what people in the middle of Yorkshire in the 1840s would be familiar with at all.
I think that's interesting too, because the idea of him being found in Liverpool and sort of brought, from the very kind of urban, this massive town, really important, into the countryside. That seems to me to be quite significant too. That he's sort of plunged into the heart of the north of England, and it's quite an isolated place. That he, like you say, he's just such an outsider to all of that. Everything about his life up until that point has been completely different from the place he ends up in Wuthering Heights. But I don't know if you've. I've visited Haworth, where the Brontes grew up. I don't know if you know that the town.
I haven't been there. I've driven past it because it's quite nice.
It's your part of the world, really, Hannah. It's
I know.
You are more familiar with the Northern English landscape than I was growing up. But when I visited, I was struck by just how, it's beautiful, but it's a kind of, it's not an easy place to live. It's very cold and windy, and the moors. Maybe you could just talk a bit more about that, for maybe, because I can imagine if you're an American listening, or even just from another part of Europe, you might not be familiar with just how distinct that part of the country is.
Yeah, it's the moors. It's a tricky one because it's gorgeous. It's very beautiful. It's like breathtaking landscape, and especially when it's got like a really bright grey sky. Because it's like, oh, is it going to rain or not? But it's also very dangerous and bleak and open. Not mmany trees, not many woodlands. So complete like side rain lashing you. But yeah, it's wild, it's bleak, it's sparse. If anybody has seen The League of Gentlemen with the local shop for local people, so that is just on a little hill by itself. And the joke is that that's always been on the little hill by itself, because they're like, oh, it's just for local people, but the local people might walk 2 miles to get to it.
Yeah.
It's that isolated, these little pockets of Yorkshire. And these moors, that they're in Manchester as well, Greater Manchester. And I think it was I can't remember exactly where, but the Moors murders in the late 20th century.
Yeah, to go back to Myra Hindley again. Yeah,
Hindley,
and they still
it was
haven't found the bodies of all the children that were killed in the Moors murders, because the Moors because they're so big. This is the thing; it's vast, isn't it? Really beautiful, but vast and quite frightening.
And I think do they move around in some areas? I'm sure they're not just solid ground.
Ooh,
I think there's a bit of movement of mud in some of them. I don't know if it's like down in Devon and Cornwall.
like a desert that kind of
Yeah,
like retreats and grows.
yeah, it's a bit like quicksand. I don't know what it's called exactly, but there's boggy areas of it that you couldn't build houses on it, for example,
Mm.
which makes it harder to then find bodies.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, the moors are wild, and you have to know them. You can't just go for a stroll. Like I don't know them. I couldn't go there and be like, oh yeah, go on. I'll walk to the nearest town because no, an outsider couldn't do that. But Heathcliff and Kathy make it their home, uh,
Mm.
and find a way to navigate this bleak, isolated world that they live in. But yeah, it's very strange that uh, yeah, it's. So Polly's saying, yeah, it's uncivilized. I mean, Catherine is a bit wild as well. Is that Heathcliff rubbing off on her, or has she always been a bit of
Mm.
a freak? That's another
The,
question about her.
the when you mention the League of Gentlemen, that just makes me think as well, Hannah, having you here as someone who's from Yorkshire, right? You grew up in Yorkshire, is that
No,
right?
no, I'm from
Oh,
Liverpool. I'm
sorry.
in.
I didn't mean that
Yeah.
you were from. I thought you were from the. I thought you were from the area. But yeah, you're a northerner. I mean, how do you feel about the way that people talk about the northernness of the novel? Because I know that sometimes there's a frustration for people writing about that part of England that they get kind of caricatured in a way, and I mean there's a kind of there's a bit of a north south divide in England where
Yeah.
because London is in the south, and I know you know this, Hannah, I'm just just in case anyone
Oh
listening
yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
know.
For the
um
benefit of everyone. Yeah.
but because London is in the south, and a lot of art and culture that is funded in London,
Mm-hmm.
it can sometimes feel like whenever something comes from the north of England, whether it's a poet or a book or TV show, the Brontes, they get kind of, there is a tendency perhaps to kind of slightly other and exoticize. Ooh, this is a
Yeah.
northern story. So I wondered how you, as someone who's from the north of England, feel about that.
Well, you do get othered, and you've heard the term Northern Monkey. Uh,
I've
yeah,
certainly never used
yeah. Well,
it.
there's terms that have been used to describe Northern people because historically, this is where all the industry was. This is where all the industrial towns were. Whereas moving down to London, that was for the gentlemen and the ladies and the bankers, and um, the north is very much not not what they think of when it came to the arts.
Hmm.
But yeah, for the Brontes up here, and I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think where Gaskell is from. Uh, it might
Yeah.
not be the north, but she did write Mary Barton, which was about people in Manchester during the
Mm.
Industrial Revolution. She was telling a story about their experience of poverty and working in the mills and so on.
Did
So I
she
said,
move? Did she move north? Because that's what happens in north and south. Is that the heroine, her
yeah,
dad loses his job and they have to move north to a northern parish, and that's all about that kind of transition. So I
these
can't
strange
remember, but I
people in the
suspect.
north.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think she might have moved because I'm sure her husband came to Liverpool a few times to do lectures, and she was really good friends with Charlotte Bronte. Like they were best friends.
Mm.
So she must have been nearby.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly where she lived, but I think Elizabeth Gaskell did come up here,
Mm.
and she must have known some things. She wrote a few novels about the north.
Yeah.
I don't know how northern she is, if she's northern at all, but she definitely liked us, so that
Mm.
counts for something. Uh, but yeah, we were very much regarded as other, strange, weird Northerners. I think in North and South, and this actually comes from someone on social media who writes a lot of 1860s Victorian stories. I think she was very adamant that men and women did not shake hands. That never happened. However, in North and South, um, the northern guy, I can't remember his name. All I can think of is Richard Armitage.
Yeah, I can't remember his
What
name
I mean,
either. It's
um,
years since, like, the mill owner, the one that's
the mill
the
owner, yeah,
Mr. Darcy of the story.
yeah, yeah. Richard Armitage. He shakes hands with everyone because he's
Mm.
friendly. Um,
Mm.
and the girl who's moved up from the south. This is terrible. I've gone completely character blank.
Oh, look, Polly says Gaskell, born in London, brought up in Knutsford,
Knutsford, Cheshire.
Yeah.
She was up here then, so
Yeah.
she's a northerner. Yeah, that's fine. Cheshire's as south as we'll go when it comes to the north, but yeah, it's northern.
But that's right. But so she did. Okay, that's similar to her, to the main character of North and South, who has the southern origin, and then
yeah, she must have come up here and been shocked at the behaviour and how, men shake hands with women up here. It's really weird. But yeah, there was a bit where there's a handshake, and the girl who's come up from the south is like, "Well, that's really weird." He tried to shake my hand. He tried to touch my hand. I mean, we don't even know each other's names yet.
How intimate.
But Northerners far more friendly, far more relaxed, and I think we still have that reputation to this day of being friendly.
Yes.
Yeah. And then when we go down south, like to London, like the big busy city, it's terrifying. But yeah, I think seeing this novel, and it's like about this wild place up in the north where a lot of readers possibly will never go.
Yeah.
And it's a world they are not familiar with. It must have seemed not magical, but kind of something out of a folklore story. And Heathcliff is wild, he's other, he's probably the closest a lot of these young ladies reading this novel will come to a wild man. But I think, do you think part of this story is like Emily trying to navigate between living somewhere really wild, but the girl's got a good education because her dad's a pastor? She must have felt caught between two worlds.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, and I was sort of wondering that, because if the northernness of the novel feels really particularly important for Wuthering Heights, maybe more so than for other Bronte novels. I don't know how I feel about that, but I wondered, if this wasn't written by somebody who grew up in this little village, Haworth, would we feel like, would it feel almost like a cliche about northerners? But she's from, that's it's her home. And I remember when I went, we tried to walk to, there's a place kind of off on the moors where there's some sort of ruin or site which is meant to be the inspiration for Wuthering Heights, and we didn't make it. I was there doing with a play, and there was a rehearsal going on, and I had to go back. We had to turn around because it was taking such a long time. We massively underestimated how long it would take us. There was kind of a route through a waterfall, and it was really beautiful, but it was totally, even Haworth's on its own, and then and is very beautiful, and is a nice little village where the Brontes lived and grew up, and you can go and see their house. But the Wuthering Heights site is totally on its own. It's even so even from the fairly isolated village, you're then even more isolated when you go out to the house. And yeah, I can't remember what the question was, but it was just anyway. It felt so much like it was so born of that, of her experience of living in that kind of place. And you asked me about the contrast between that and her education. One thing that comes across when you're looking at their materials, that the material associated with their lives, is just how imaginative they were, and how actually in a lot of their kind of childhood early works, kind of juvenilia stuff, it's all set in fantasy places, and it's kind of these like made up, they would draw maps, and create these worlds, which I'm sure a lot of us did when we were teenagers, but they were totally escapist. They had nothing really to do with, and then all of them seem to have returned to quite a kind of familiar local, socially aware, way of writing as adults. So I don't know. There's definitely an interesting tension there, escapist but also familiar. One thing that struck me about their house, which is a big old vicarage, is that it's on the edge of the graveyard. So when you walk out their front door, there's just immediately tombstones, and that feels quite it feels quite appropriate for them, that they are just surrounded by quite bleak scenery, death. It was, it's not exactly a cozy place to grow up, I suppose.
No, well, they reckon that it was the graveyards that killed them. dirty water,
Oh,
because the
not from
well,
corpses. That's horrible.
yeah, well, a lot of the way they lived is the church and the graveyard or burial grounds were above the houses, because it's all on hills.
Yeah, that's right. It's very slow.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so the water, it trickles down, and they suspect um that the pollution in the water from the graveyards contributed towards well, I mean, all of them died young, but I think definitely with Emily, they think she could have been, drinking the dirty water, and her younger sisters as well, and her brother. But they all, the ones who lived to adulthood, so Emily, Anne, Charlotte, and Bramwell, all, when you said about the escapism and they loved
Mm,
fantasy and imagining these fairy worlds, they each of them did have bonkers real life experiences in a way. So Charlotte, I'm sure, took at least one stint as a governess, and
mm,
that was bizarre because she was really educated, and this was a common thing for children of clergymen. They would be educated right into, being able to hold a conversation with the upper classes.
mm,
Financially, they didn't have the connections or the assets, so they just
mm,
lived in this kind of middle area and didn't belong in either world.
yeah.
So I think Charlotte wrote about. I've read so many of their letters. Like, I feel, I had this big fat book. I'll add this when this video goes up next week. I'll add, all the books and stuff. But I read their letters, and she was a governess, and it was the most isolating job she ever had, and it was a really isolating experience because she didn't belong with the family, and she didn't belong with the servants. She just
Yeah.
kind of lived in the middle. But she got to observe a lot of how other people live, more
Mm,
civilized people. Bramwell took it a step further. He had a fling with the lady of the house, who he was a tutor for the kids, and he took it a step further. He got a real experience of what it's like with the others. So yeah, Branwell was quite class defying in a way, but obviously that ruined him. And then there was the drink, and Branwell was, died young,
mm,
unfortunately. But it's interesting how each of them, maybe not so much Emily, although I refuse to believe she was just this recluse who only talked to her dogs. She must have had a bit of a life, even if it was just seeing the same one person every week at church. There
mm,
must have been something. Um, but all of them did get a little taste of how the other side live.
mhm,
Um, and I think that must have informed, certainly bringing more realistic, I say realistic, but we've still got like Heathcliff, but more realistic characters into their fantastical world. And as we see with all their novels, but with Heathcliff, I sometimes wondered, because people talk about, is Heathcliff supposed to just represent the wilder side of the Victorian psyche, or is Heathcliff brought into a more civilized situation, and this is all us just watching how people react?
mm,
Is he his own character, or is he supposed to represent part of Catherine? Is he supposed to represent part of Emily? All these things we'd love to ask them.
yeah. Yeah, interesting. I wonder as well, because sometimes when you're reading, I mean, this kind of cuts to the heart of like what you do when you read and you think about books and their symbols, right? Is how, to what extent do we want to bring a kind of modern sensibility to a text? To what
Yeah.
extent do we want to try to understand it in its original context? And sometimes texts that we love because we sort of think that they mean one thing or they've come to mean one thing in adaptation are actually doing something very different, maybe something a bit less comfortable.
Mm.
And you could argue that it's sort of like that Aesop fable of the farmer who brings the snake into his home, right? He is sympathetic towards this little hatchling snake that he finds all hurt in the
Mm.
fields, brings it in, warms it up, by the heat of his bosom, and then what does it do? Of course, it bites him because it's a snake. And there's this idea, maybe, you could argue that Wuthering Heights is a kind of, well, what did you expect kind of story where the father, Kathy's father, brings this little hatchling into the house,
Ragamuffin.
this ragamuffin, and from a very traditional class perspective,
Mm.
the kind of the prejudiced perspective would be, well, yeah, his nature, his natural nature, his natural tendencies came out. He grew up into exactly what he was always destined to be, but you've just put him in fancier clothes and given him the run of the house. So superficially, I guess that's sort of true of Heathcliff, but I don't think we think that's all that Emily is doing with him. It
Mm.
feels, I don't think it's just a modern sensibility imposed upon the novel, to say that he's more than that. I think we feel that he is sort of richly, deeply interesting and textured, and like I said at the beginning, I think we sympathise with him because he's molded by everybody else's expectation that he's going to be a terrible person. He's going to be lesser. He shouldn't aspire to marry Kathy. He shouldn't aspire to be the master of the house. So yeah, I don't know. He's a very interesting person. But he isn't
Mm.
likable. I don't think he's ever really likable. Even if he is sympathetic, I've never really. I wouldn't want to spend any time with him. You really
No.
feel when he's kind of like brought into, when what's his name, the narrator is brought in to sleep in Kathy's room. You just feel like, oh, this is miserable. I wouldn't want to be staying in this house with these people. Like, what have I walked into? This guy's awful.
Yeah. Well, and also I feel that with Heathcliff, he's one of those people. Well, I mean, his character, but he's one of those characters that if you did spend time with him, he would just be working out what he could get out of you, or
Yeah,
what he could hold over your heads, what he could extort out of you,
yeah,
basically. Because well, he's that's just how he's been brought up, basically.
mm.
But I was going to ask about who is the It's not his kid. It's Hindley's kid. What's Hindley's kid called?
Oh my god! Don't
The
don't do
son.
don't the
It's
names.
so complicated. It's like Curtin.
Yeah, yeah,
Is it
yeah.
Curtin?
I think
Anyway,
so.
it
And they're
might be.
kind of sweet, aren't they? That the children are. That's the thing about Wuthering Heights. Everybody always forgets that final act.
Mm,
That it has this slightly sort of redemptive thing going on with the children, who seem
yeah,
to have inherited the better qualities of their various parents.
yeah. Like Hindley's was cruel to Heathcliff. His son was basically brought up as Heathcliff was brought up, but is still his nature, him being kind, uh, prevails.
Mm,
It doesn't matter how cruelly Heathcliff treated him. He is kind.
mm.
He's wild. He can't read. Um, but and I think he sleeps in the stables or something, doesn't he? But he's kind, and that for me, that bit of the book at the end always made me think: is it nature or nurture?
Yeah, yeah,
With the kids, is it nature or nurture?
yeah.
Because none of them seem to be as cruel as Kathy and Heathcliff.
I wonder as well if, because one of the questions that we were discussing in advance of having this chat, or that you mentioned to me, was the idea of this is a Gothic novel, right? And
Mm,
I wonder whether the kind of nature nurture thing also speaks to that. How we categorize this as in terms of genre, because when I think of Gothic, when I think of the Gothic genre, the kind of origins of the Gothic genre are in sort of excess, and if you think about books like The Castle of Otranto or The Monk by Matthew Lewis, it's like every page another ridiculous sensational thing happens.
mm,
None of the characters feel particularly real. Everybody feels disposable. There is a huge amount of supernatural, goings on, and everything seems turned up to 11. Um,
mm.
and I guess nature and nurture are, it's much more sort of flatly obvious what's going on,
Yeah,
like a beauty, like the heroine is just the heroine. She's always been the heroine. She's not a complex personality. The villain is usually born with a deformity of some kind. It's like these really
yeah,
unpleasant old-fashioned prejudices about what evil people look like, and they're maybe like from a particular class or race or background. um the Gothic genre, maybe I'm being unfair to the Gothic genre, but in its origins, certainly it feels like a genre that's very very disinterested in the complexities of how a person's education might shape them. Does that feel fair? Whereas Wuthering Heights
No,
absolutely is interested in that.
I think, no, you're absolutely right. And as Jane Austen pointed it out in Northanger Abbey, so I had so many laugh out loud moments with
Yeah.
Northanger Abbey because it's just a piss take of Gothic literature at the time. So obviously Jane was writing that, end of the 18th century, early 19th century, but it's a refreshing look at Gothic fiction and how it was borderline ridiculous, like you
Yes.
said. But maybe Gothic literature, that was the origin, but it kind of evolved into something a bit more. Um, I actually think where you add the realism, you add the horror, if
Yeah.
you know what I mean.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
Frankenstein, for example, um, no, I wouldn't know how to make a man out of bits of man, but at the time, it didn't seem far fetched.
No.
Just a kind of, it was a bit of what if ism,
Yeah.
like people at the time will not have explored this avenue. So a novel about it, and in a way that seems quite, not too ridiculous or far fetched,
Mm.
I think made Gothic fiction a bit more. Uh, I suppose scary is the word, a little bit
Mm.
more unsettling. And then when you've got Emily writing Wuthering Heights, we have characters that are quite realistic in a way. So Catherine, coming from this family that is so old that
Mm.
the name is in the brick on the door. It's this kind of ancestral, um, secretive kind of aristocratic theme going on that pops up in things like The American by Henry James. There's kind of these old
Mm.
families with their dark secrets and
Yeah.
their dark history. So I think maybe when authors like Shelley and the Brontes kind of brought in more realistic elements, I think that kind of revived Gothic literature.
That's really interesting. So, what would you? Because this is interesting to me because my main period of study um, is the early modern period. So,
Yeah.
really, the discussions about the Gothic are a bit beyond my area of specialty. But so I'm sort of reaching back to undergraduate stuff to remember all that I read of the Gothic genre. But what would you define as Gothic then? So if Gothic started off, because I remember from undergraduate that the idea of Gothic as an insult, the word as an insult, kind of comes from architecture, like something that is sort of
Hmm.
brutally extravagant, or that's sort of superficial and over the top, and that then gets applied to literature. So the early Gothic is very much it's kind of almost a bit of a trashy genre. So how would
Hmm.
you define the Gothic today, given that it's come through those developments that you discussed?
I think it's just heavily involved with identity. And the Gothic, like someone has said here in the comments as well, that we're not seeing Emily as a woman in this with fantasies. Well, that ties into thinking of Gothic as a way of kind of looking into the human condition. It's other lives you could have lived. It's kind of like a
Yeah.
sliding doors thing. So um, Gothic lit, certainly in the 19th century, was heavily hung up on identity and the dark side of everybody's soul, the fantasies they can't enact, the desires they can't fulfill. So I think just Gothic fiction, even still today, it's a way of looking at ourselves, but in a way that it's a little bit safe because it's not a real world, if you know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean. I was just thinking about like the picture of Dorian Gray, that's all about art for art's sake and the aesthetics and the beauty of life and so on, but it all has a dark underbelly. um and I think that's all Gothic literature does, is it makes us look at the shadow behind the curtain,
Mm,
essentially, and almost frightening ourselves with our own desires and reflections and how we feel about things, um as opposed to just looking at it and judging. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, interesting. I wonder then. So it sounds like Gothic and Gothic horror are
Mm.
almost synonymous? I mean, to what? I
Yeah.
wonder about, because I'm really interested in horror and the horror genre, and I wouldn't naturally think of Wuthering Heights necessarily as a horror novel, and yet it does have a ghost scene, and it does feel haunted, and what you just said about the Gothic genre is also a comment about horror. It's about the history of
Mm.
the horror genre too, and I wonder whether, I don't know, and when I, because I was looking at obviously the song Wuthering Heights, which is all about the ghost scene, and that's
Mm.
usually the scene that people remember from adaptations, is Kathy knocking on the window. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe. How do you feel about the how do you feel about the horror elements of Wuthering Heights, the novel?
And well, I think there's also that kind of imagery of Heathcliff being possessed.
Mm,
A lot of the way he behaves, and like when they find his body at the end, he's sitting there with a grin on his face, and it's not like he had a happy ending. It was just like, oh, that's a bit of a disturbing way to, and also let's not forget him digging up Kathy's grave.
yeah.
These are socially unacceptable things. These are not the ways that you behave. And for a lot of Victorians, when things were about sensibility, and decency, it is horrific to see characters acting in a way that is not decent,
Mm,
or acting in a way that is not very Christian, or however the ideals were at the time. And also there's the insinuation that Kathy and Heathcliff have had a physical relationship, which
mm,
again is horrific, because that is not allowed.
mm,
It's that kind of, I mean, if you were looking at it from that kind of puritanical view at the time, it's kind of, it's the whole thing's laced with sin. you know?
yeah.
She's a woman
Yeah.
who has desires. Kathy is not a vessel for men's desire. She has desires of her own. She has passion, and that is something that is not. I mean, that is not a Victorian ideal, is it? The angel of the house. They were publishing periodicals and pamphlets teaching women how to be an excellent homemaker. The angel in the house, like,
Yeah.
you're so angelic, we can't hear you past the room. And then you've got Kathy, who's like, wants to act out all of her fantasies,
Mm.
and wants to have it all. Um, and at the time, it was a shocker.
And I don't think at any point in the story you feel as if Kathy has been corrupted by Heathcliff. It's not like she was this there's a little delicate thing and then she's twisted. She's already quite kind of tough and
Mm,
brutish, and she's already sort of like growing up on the moors and being wilder than other girls could, just because of the geography, just because there's not much else to do but scramble around on the rocks and play outside and play in storms, and get used to hanging around with animals and things like that. And she's already that, and Heathcliff just sort of, it's like she's found the other half of her soul, right? And
yeah, like two peas in a pod.
yeah, and she calls him her soul, doesn't she? And
Mm,
and so it's as if, yeah, that's quite transgressive too, that she's not a woman corrupted, she's a sort of
yeah,
she's met her match in Heathcliff. He's kind of brought something out of her, or she gets to kind of indulge in those parts of her character with him. But it is interesting that Kathy doesn't, I always found it so strange when I was a child reading it, that she doesn't marry Heathcliff, that she's not
mm,
interested in that she so doesn't see marriage as a sort of passionate union. She's got quite a kind of pragmatic view of marriage. It's like, no, I'm going to
mm.
marry the guy who's rich, who will make me comfortable, because I like being comfortable, and maybe I'll still hang out with you, Heathcliff. I can have it both ways. Um, yeah, quite
And
kind of.
she lies to herself. Uh, Lies to herself and is miserable. And also when she goes and stays with Edgar's family, when she breaks her leg, like, just being wild.
Mm,
She, they try to train her. They try to essentially break her in, turn her into a
mm,
nice young lady, and she rejects that. She rejects it all. And you know, she she's not just passionate and willful, but she's also a bit mental.
yeah.
Like an example of women who are wild.
Mm,
Not only can you not train them, but they don't make the best decisions.
mm,
she makes herself sick with when Heathcliff decides, oh, well, she hasn't married me, so I've come back just to torment her. I could have
Mm.
moved on with my life, but I want to torment her. And then, she's ill to the point where, like, she dies in childbirth. Kathy's wild, and they've tried to tame her. But also, I wanted to talk to you about Edgar's sister.
Mm.
Does that feel like a cautionary tale?
Mm.
The young woman. So I don't know about you, but when you were like a teenager in your early 20s, bad boys, very interesting. It was like, oh, why would I want to go out with him? He's sensible and he studies and he has a job. That's boring. You want to go out with the bad boy. But then as you progress into your 20s and into your 30s, you're like, no, I want someone who offers stability. I want someone who pays his bills on time. That's really attractive. But Edgar's sister, she wants a bit of that.
Mm.
Again, that to me felt like a cautionary tale of how, do not lead with your heart. You have to be sensible. Otherwise, it'll all just come crashing down.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know, how old is she supposed to be when she marries Heathcliff?
About the same age as Kathy. They're all like in their early 20s.
Mm.
But Heathcliff, I can't remember how old he is. He goes off into the army, doesn't he, for a few
Yeah,
years?
it feels like he's older than her, right? I can't remember exactly the
Yeah,
details.
it's Edgar's younger sister, and I think Edgar's about the same age as Kathy.
Yeah, Kathy and Heathcliff, right? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So yes, it's interesting because thinking about again how novels change as you read them, as you come
Mm,
back to them later. I'm sure that everybody listening has got an example of a book that they've read twice. They read once as a teenager or a child, and then they
yeah.
read again, and it completely changed for them. And one story that changes quite a lot for me is, and I've always loved it, but is Pride and Prejudice. To go back to Austen, because you look at you look at Lydia's life totally
Mm,
differently when you're when you're 30 than you do when you're 16, because you
yeah.
don't she's so young, she's like
Like
15, 16.
15?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Wickham's got a history of doing that with young women, of he's really sleazy, actually. It's a really horrible character. And yeah, and I don't, yeah, so as a cautionary tale, I mean, if we think of her as someone who's very young, yes,
And
I
then
think
it's,
yes. Yeah, I
yeah.
think she is. But I think also possibly, I don't know, again, thinking about the whole novel, is there a sort of cautionary tale about letting your sister hang out with someone like that? Or, is it a cautionary tale for the men as much as it is for the young
Mm,
woman? She, she was she was honestly drawn to him, and what could have been done. I don't know. I don't know. It's a difficult one. The idea of it as a cautionary tale is interesting. I
yeah,
don't
because
know.
well, we ultimately we will never know because what the author intended is always going to be open for interpretation. I mean, just look at English teachers; they find more meanings than you can shake a stick at for
Yeah.
things. So we will never know, but there's so many things that Wuthering Heights could mean.
Mm,
But what we'll do is next week when I pop this video up, I will encourage some discussion about this. What is Wuthering Heights to you?
mm,
What do you think it is a story about? And see what people come up with. I think that'd be a good way to start that conversation when I put this video up next week. Um, but you can think of it between now and then as well. What is Wuthering Heights?
mm.
I'll leave you with that one to think about, um, and then we'll pick it up next week in the newsletter. Like, what is Wuthering Heights?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And also, I think, and that, what is Wuthering Heights to you is also something that is massively affected by
Mm,
the versions that you've seen, because
yeah.
different directors and different adaptations have taken different angles on the story. And like the song Wuthering Heights wasn't inspired by the book; it was inspired by the scene in the adaptation, so the TV adaptation. So that, and I think, if I remember rightly, it's a while since I read that article, but I think that the TV adaptation changes it tells the story chronologically. So it starts with Heathcliff coming to the house, and it tells the story of him growing up with Kathy, and then at the end you have, what's his name? Is it Lockwood? I'm terrible
Yes,
with
it might be.
You have him in the room. People always think it's Heathcliff in the room, but he's put in Kathy's old room because he's a guest, and it's a spare room that's been kept. And then that's when he finds, I think it's her diary, isn't it? And then so it's interesting that in the show the ghost was the kind of climax of the story. I think that's right. But anyway, different adaptations will take. So there've been modern adaptations that have taken a very strong stance on the racial element, that he is not white, and that's why you could have one that picked up on the Irish idea. I don't know if that's happened. I'm sure that it has. So I'm sure that people's responses will also be shaped by the history of this story and its retellings, and I think that that's as interesting as anything else. So it'd be fascinating to hear that. Yeah.
I'll ask that question. So it'll be, what is Wuthering Heights to you? What is it about to you? And I'm sure we'll get loads of interesting responses to that one. But yeah, it was so good to be able to pin you down to talk about this, because there's so much we can say about Wuthering Heights. You can talk about Wuthering Heights till the cows come home. But
thank you for asking me. It was fun to be asked to talk about it, and it's nice to talk about 19th century literature for me, because, like I say, I'm normally talking about 16th and 17th century. But
early modern stuff. Yeah. It was great to catch up with you and have that chat about Gothic lit and Wuthering Heights. And well, you will catch Dr Rebekah King around with her next Horror Moments newsletter. When's that coming? Look, letters. I'm in the 19th century. Letters. When is your next Horror Moments?
My horror moments. So I do a horror moment series where we look at horror inflected scenes and themes in unexpected places, and the current series is on the weird TV show Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, which is based on internet shorts that you might have seen on YouTube. And those come out every Thursday morning. There was a season on Kate Bush songs, so one of those was the Wuthering Heights episode. If you want to go and read that.
I'll link that to next week's article.
There you go. So and then on Mondays I just do miscellaneous articles and quizzes and all sorts of other things. So if you're interested in horror, magic, theatre, storytelling, history, then you might enjoy my Substack.
You might. I do. But yeah, others definitely will. But yeah, it's been lovely to catch you, and I will get this up next week and see what everyone else thinks about what is Wuthering Heights. Thank you for joining us, anyone who has been here watching. I tried to get through the comments as much as possible, but they don't half fly past. So been trying to get in touch with the comments. We will get better at this. So yeah, it was great to catch you, Rebecca, and have a lovely weekend.
You too. Lovely to chat.
See you soon.